So we're going to start our next session. So I think this is one we've all been looking forward to with Dr. James Waters with IDO Research and the Kingdom Impact Framework. So yesterday I was asking James on, hey, do you want me to read the bio or how do you want to do this? He humbly just said, hey, just say this is James. So this is our friend James.
Amazing. That, by the way, that actually came from a conviction that I had, where I don't know if any of you heard about a real move of the Spirit at Asbury University recently. But I flew out there, me and a bunch of crazy European friends were just like, we need to see this. And I was so struck. We actually had the privilege of like meeting the leaders, just God opened those doors, and we watched them like every single session get up on stage and not introduce themselves. They wouldn't even say who they were. And like I was like, there was no. So this is completely off topic, but it explains why I was inspired by that. There was no green room because they didn't need one. Like the guy who pretty much like prayed the whole thing in, which that's controversial. I'll talk to me about later, but the real father of the whole movement. He would regularly get stopped by security because they didn't know who he was. I was like, this is a different form of church, and God loves it. So anyway, that was where that came from. And then maybe in complete contrast to that, I'm going to tell you my background. But that's more because I want to just relate to you. So anyway, I promise it's not going to have any titles in it. So, but more my story, I guess. So, so I came from international development. I did a PhD because I graduated my master's around the financial crash. Not that I wanted to be an academic, no offense, academics. But it was just amazing. I got to do a PhD looking at the resilience of slum dwellers. So my sort of first experience of really measuring intangibles was right at the micro. 720 semi-structured interviews with slum dwellers at a local field team. And it was just incredible. Totally transformative experience for me. And then I worked for a couple of years for a large engineering firm whose clients were like Rockefeller, USAID, thinking about small issues like how climate change is going to impact Asian cities. I mean, it was huge. Like thinking about how do you think about resilience for global cities. I mean, so I literally went from the micro to the macro, got a lot of kind of academic traits smashed out of me. Like that's good enough. What are you talking about now? Present it to the client. I'm like, I know, but we haven't read all the literature. What are you talking about? Get it on a PowerPoint, And so that's sort of a little bit of my background. But the reason why I'm doing this is that I ended up leading a couple of Christian ministries and had friends in the kind of missions and development world. And very much not talking about this room, because this room is different. But I was just so frustrated, I think in a godly way, of knowing people that could raise 200-300 grand by putting some pictures of refugees on a slideshow, and people would give money without there being any strategy or awareness of impact. And so I was then getting so inspired by actually the world of impact investing, secular impact investing, where there's been really robust development of social impact metrics and organizational health assessments, things like B Corp and the IRIS metrics and even the SDGs. And so I was just like, okay, well, first of all, these guys need to learn from this, right? We need to be like really measuring social impact and well-being in a robust and standardized way. And then secondly, if the world has managed to measure things that are as complex as well-being, we wouldn't have been having this conversation. Samuel can correct me, but I don't know, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, there weren't these validated measures of well-being. And so I thought, well, I might be crazy or naive or a bit of both, but like that surely must be possible in the spiritual realm as well. And so, could we come up with validated, standardized measures to at least help us see the impact that we're having? So that's why I quit my job and kind of went into this. And so this afternoon, the graveyard shift, we'll get through this. I'll just briefly mention, the problem, why I got into this, the vision, like where I really see this, not just through my work, but where I see this movement, I guess, going, how we develop this, the KIF, key lessons we learned along the way, next steps and challenges ahead. So the problem, as I saw it, and forgive me for being a bit critical, again, this is not aimed at you, this is aimed at the ecosystem, was great work being done by Christian development organizations. Amazing. And that the assessment of economic and social impact being really well developed with standard metrics, like the Progress Out of Poverty Index. But really, there being no robust framework and set of metrics to capture spiritual impact. Or if there were, they were academic metrics that no practitioner I knew, apart from Emily, knew about. Or maybe Lincoln. And so what does that mean? Organizations are unable to truly understand their spiritual impact, and donors are left unable to actually engage in this, amazing story. And so what was the vision? The vision was, could organizations be able to gather straightforward information in order to understand, improve, and demonstrate kingdom impact? By that I mean social and spiritual impact to all stakeholders. Ultimately, that evidence of spiritual impact improving what we're doing and more funding flowing to effective organizations, which I think EA cares about. And so the objective, how would we do this? Well, I thought to myself, I don't want to spend another 10 years trying to be the world's leading academic in this, but there's so much information in the room. I basically went to the Accord conference where I met people like Rebecca, and all these amazing organizations said, yeah, we're trying to do this. We're really trying to do this, and we're trying to do this in our little silo. Hope, I think we're on the Hope Quotient 1.0. I was like, amazing, and somebody else was doing something else. And so I basically, on the last day, just at a lunch, I said, guys, why don't I just help bring all of this insight together and we work on something together that could serve the whole ecosystem. So that's what we did with friends and partners in the room. So this is the kind of process that we've been through. So we started off with a literature review and the conceptual framework. I'll mention in a second just how many metrics we looked at, and I'm sure there's many more, but it was thorough. It was like over, anyway, it was in the hundreds. It was a few years ago now. So we looked at frameworks first of all, then compiled a bank of metrics, ran a thematic analysis, created a set of categories, that's step 2, and then said, and this is really how you create any survey, right? Excuse me. So then piloted the questions, training, pre-testing, surveying, then running the analysis, running factor analysis, score analysis, validity analysis, which probably means got a lot to realize more and more that 90% of this room is high geek. So I used to say factor analysis and people's eyes would glaze over, and now they're like, exploratory or confirmatory? I'm like, okay. I'll step aside. And then repeating that 4 times, so 3 different organizations, 4 countries across 3 continents. One of which was actually a child and youth development organization, all doing slightly different things. And so iterating it every time. And this collaboration, just to shout out the partners, was we had ICM, Living Water, Hope International, Water Mission, Compassion International, Kingdom Workers, and AMG International. And also, quite often we would meet to share learnings, talk about methodology. We brought in Bruce Widdick, had asked Professor Boas, multiple calls with David Brockmer. These are all kind of professors in specifically spiritual metrics. And, and honestly, this was me not trying to be the expert, just saying, guys, tear it apart. I want to, from my work in consultancy, let's get something out there, right? Because something's better than nothing. So the lit review, what did this look like? And how do you create a framework that captures social and spiritual impact for implementation across different organizations and different contexts? Well, it needs to be based on a broad theory, a broad theology, and a broad praxis. So we started reviewing all of the frameworks we could get our hands on. As I mentioned, the social impact frameworks are relatively well developed, but spiritual measures were harder to find. But actually, and this is the exciting thing, and I'll come back to this later, it's not just this space that's trying to do this, right? There's the business as mission world. There's academia. So you've got Christian development and mission. All of these organizations, to some degree or other, had various frameworks or metrics. And this is a highlight, by the way. You've got the Christian impact investing world, who are also trying to vet spiritual impact. You've got the business's mission world, and you've got academic and theological frameworks. And there are obviously more here. So we came up with this framework, and what was really lovely is that as we ran the thematic analysis, these three high-level themes emerged of relationship or love for others, love for God, and love for self. And I just had this penny drop moment. And actually at this stage, I hadn't become a fanboy of Brian Fickett and others and their great work on the Shalom framework. So I didn't know that theologically more robust people than me had already pinned this down. And so I just thought, that's beautiful. What is the great commandment? To love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our might, and to love others as we love ourselves. I'm like, this is, if Jesus said it's important, that feels like a great place to start. And so that's what the framework looks at. Love for God, love for self, and love for others. I will fully admit that it should include a creation component to be a more robust shalom and reconciliation framework. But I blame the organizations that we reviewed for not having metrics on it. I should have done it. Anyway, it's actually just not as robust, I would say, in the literature on those organizations. And so, as I said, there's then almost later I realized you've got the Shalom framework that people like Partners Worldwide use. This aligns to an academic framework called the Theistic Spiritual Outcome Survey. Brian Myers did amazing work on this. Brian Fickett has just released an amazing book that he says is better than When Helping Hurts, where he really talks about this concept of shalom. And this, for me, is well-being, right? Now, I'm not saying this is the perfect tool even or set of metrics that you should all use, but I believe there's something here that as Christians needs to underpin our measurement and our awareness of impact, because this is biblically based. This I believe we can measure robustly, and this in my opinion is an amazing overarching measure of well-being. And I'll say one other thing to address something that's come up over the last couple of days. And maybe this will raise more questions than answers. Many, many, many times. And we now have 6 to 8 different tools. Many times people say to me, yes, but doesn't the spiritual pervade everything? Or and then they also say to me, but is the spiritual distinct? My answer is yes. Right? As in, I think quite often we have this Greek mindset, this dualistic mindset that I don't think Jesus had. And again, I'm not a theologian, but I actually believe sometimes we trip up over our own dualistic logic. And actually, does the spirituality, should our faith pervade everything? Yes. But should there also be something distinctive in who we are and what we do? Yes. And so that's some of what we're coming at with this. And just to say, I fully believe this should be used along things like PHQ-9 that are obviously a robust mental health measure that's just been mentioned. We've piloted this almost every time alongside the PPI, standardized poverty measure, and maybe even other education, physical health, or poverty scores. To get into the weeds a little bit more, the questions look at both values, actions, or fruit, or to use the sociological language, what you believe, what you practice, and what you experience. And the reason for that, I was just talking about a tool that was used to measure spirituality many, many times, or a large amount in the US. And it's been criticized a lot more recently, and that's because quite often we either just go, well, what do they believe? Right? I just want to tick off, do they have the right beliefs? Or we just, but that's not the fruit of faith at work, right? I don't want to get, you believe the right things. You talk trash about your neighbors, but you believe the right things. Great. No. But similarly, I think in terms of more actions-focused surveys, I think the Pharisees would score quite high on those. And so I've thought about a lot of our questions, would the Pharisees score high on some of these questions? And then fruits. I think, we want our beliefs and our actions to create fruit in our lives. So that's why we have both values, actions, and fruit categories and questions. I'll speed up a little bit. So it's a quant survey where whenever we pilot or validate, we have qualitative verification of comprehension of all the questions. And it's mainly Likert scale statements with randomization and negative statements to avoid whatever that thing's called where people fall asleep halfway through a survey. And there's 3 different Likert scales. Thank you very much. What's it called again?
Fatigue, I think.
Yes, response fatigue.
Sleep is the perfectly good word.
Yeah. I mean, when someone like nods off halfway through your survey, you're like, it's too long. And that's been a really critical design factor. When Lincoln was talking about an 8-hour survey, even an hour survey, I'm like, poor people. Like, let's bring in some of these process metrics. How loved did you feel like that? No, awful. Anyway, so we've got to think about the design features as well. And so we were constantly whittling it down through the factor analyses, 3 different Likert scales. And so this is how we piloted it. We worked with this roundtable of 7 organizations. I mentioned this. So 1 to 2 weeks in the field, partnership with local teams, often integrated core measures of those organizations. For example, some wanted to ask about perception of the local church. We analyzed in real time and post. COVID, this thing called COVID happened right in the middle. We had amazing momentum. We'd run 2 pilots, and then suddenly, all of our partners understandably went into sort of crisis mode and weren't going to be spending time like validating this survey. And then just recently, we adapted it for a youth context as well. And I mentioned those guys. So how we analyzed it, I'm sure most of you know all of this stuff, so I'll zip through it. So statistical analysis, question performance, do the questions work? Does everyone, like ceiling effects, floor effects? So if everyone is answering yes to a question, it's a bad question. Factor analysis of category validity and consistency. Every time we would remove statements. And so after the first pilot, we actually had a radical reshuffle of initial categories. It was a very long pilot. ICM were very graceful with us. We radically reshuffled the category. The second pilot was with living water was much more encouraging. We started to get confirmation of categories. And then the third and fourth, we started to really refine internal consistency. And this was a process over, in total, sort of 18 months or 2 years. And then in that last pilot with AMG International, they also wanted to add an intellectual and a physical domain, so we did that as well. And we ran some confirmatory factor analysis to conclude. This you probably can't see, but it's just some of the results of the confirmatory factor analysis. And so this is like just a handful of. So this is really just to give an example of some of the categories. So value for connection, value for sharing faith, meaningful connection, trust in God, spiritual growth. And in the orange was our meta factor analysis score that was an index of all of the various factor loadings and parts of the factor analysis. So the CFA came up with the confirmatory factor analysis, said, okay, we feel comfortable with this. So these 3 dimensions I mentioned, love for self, God, others, 26 categories, which is, and also 77 questions with a short list of 26. So what did we learn in doing all this? And this isn't really anything particularly groundbreaking or pertinent to spiritual impact, but really just the issues that you have to be aware of with any kind of social science like this, right? So how do we avoid social desirability bias? Like none of this sort of graduates us from any of the challenges that I'm sure you will face when you're measuring these. You have to be very, very careful to think about social desirability bias. Very practically, I remember when our data pinged, Lincoln won't mind me saying this, enumerator number 9 having like crazy ceiling effects in all the questions. And immediately I was like, I bet you that's the pastor. And so I went and sat with some of his interviews. I was like, I would answer 10 out of 10. He is just intimidating people. But like on paper, he was a great enumerator. He knew everyone. It was honestly, it was a body language issue. And it was a kind of power dynamic issue. So none of those things go away. Gender, power dynamics, all so important. And this is really like a distillation of many, many of the questions that we thought about. And so then what is the best way to capture change in social and spiritual well-being in individuals over time, right? So how do we actually like what Paul was saying, how do we actually have robust, so we've got some questions now and we're going to make them open access, but how do we then actually use that to measure impact, right? So well-being is one thing, but impact's another. And again, many of you will have learned these lessons in your other surveys. The spiritual dynamic's not different in this, but we really pressed into it. We had a roundtable with Professor Bruce Whittick, and we were like, all of these questions, like what if RCTs aren't possible? What if the organization doesn't have the capability or capacity to run an RCT? Every time we're thinking, like, can this be used for the small and medium-sized organization, right, who aren't actually in this room, but like make up a huge, like there's over 100 organizations in the Accord network, right? Most of them aren't in this room because they're not the large organizations wrestling with this because they don't have the capacity to send someone to a conference like this, right? And that's not a bad thing, but how do we make our learnings, to pick on you, hope quotient learning, and how do we make that accessible to our brothers and sisters wrestling with this in smaller organizations? And so we looked at longitudinal versus retrospective. We found retrospective actually can be a really powerful way of capturing change, especially in subjective well-being, and my colleague Samuel wrote a paper on this. And obviously incorporating qualitative questions along the way. And so this is where we've now got to, and this is kind of quite exciting for me. This is very live. This is where we're going next. And so, and it's been quite a vulnerable journey, to be honest, because, I poured my guts into this, and to be completely candid, because I also work a little bit in the business world, I thought, man, we have put so much effort into this. These guys are going to pay for this. Like they are going to buy this up, right? Because I know that they don't have metrics. And honest, I'm not trying to make a buck off this, but I was like, this is going to be awesome. It's going to pay for itself. We can have a research assistant that can pull all the data together. We can keep improving things. And I went back to the roundtable in October at the Accord gathering and got some pretty direct feedback. No one in the Christian development space is going to pay for metrics. I was like, oh, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. I said, well, what do you guys want? What would be valuable to you? And what they said is really now what we're now sort of starting to offer, or kind of what we're about to launch, which is a learning community. And so we heard these organizations say, love that we've now got a tool, but actually, what if sort of this type of thing could be curated in a really focused way around spiritual impact? So could we, both in a high trust environment, start to share learnings with each other? So for example, maybe, and I'm going to keep picking on friends in the room, maybe Compassion aren't going to share all of their data, and that's totally fine. But Emily might say, hey, we've tried this metric and it's worked really, really well. It's helped. That's really useful data once you start adding those up in a database. From the hope quotient, we've found that these two questions have really high predictive power when it comes to predicting X, Y, and Z. From the KIF, we're already seeing the variables that seem to have a strongest correlation with other outcomes. And so the vision is to start to pull all this together in a learning community. So what's this going to offer? Access to the survey. We're actually going to make this free more broadly, but kind of really help people use it. Curation of other spiritual impact tools and metrics. We're not saying this is, the only thing. Let's curate and learn together. The possibility of comparative data sets and benchmark data. Like, the world is ahead of us on this stuff, right? And I really believe there could be power, even if it's not perfectly compatible, of looking at, say, organization X's change in purpose or sense of purpose or spiritual well-being in organization Y's, right? That becoming curated insights from spiritual impact measurement, getting this information out in the newsletter and report, regular meetings to wrestle with these questions, and hopefully, and I welcome your prayers and support and connections, we'll launch this late 2023. We're talking to a few foundations right now to hopefully catalyze it and then invite organizations in to contribute and participate in a number of different ways. So, and actually there's two organizations that are kind of here that are already kind of have said they'll jump in, who are ICM and Living Water, which is really great because they've done a ton of work on this. So here's, I'm coming into land, but here's another area that for us I think is quite an exciting next step. And you probably have heard me ask a couple of questions over the last couple of days about tech, because I'm constantly thinking about the organization that has one Merle manager, right? Or the organization who just can't put together a large report. And so I've been scoping out partners that could make this really easy for development orgs. And obviously this is fully possible for larger organizations as well. And so I don't know how well you can see this. So this is a really cool tech startup that we're just in the infancy of a partnership, where they've got a platform that effectively like automates all of, I mean, they've currently focused on the SDGs, but all kind of SDG reporting for development organizations. And so they're already saying, yeah, we'd love to onboard the KIF and we'll have those then as outcomes. So yes, you still got to collect the data, but from that point, onwards, that's again why I love the fact that Paul said, hey, there can be instances where monthly data can be more useful. And so this type of thing with monthly data becomes so powerful because you are just you are watching forever. And by the way, this then becomes a type of data that you can, if when there's a high trust environment, can be viewable by donors, right? Imagine how powerful that is. Just saying to a donor, watch, let's have a conversation next board meeting, but keep track of how we're doing over 6 months. Don't wait for us to send you a report, And so I really think this could be a way of democratizing some of this and making it accessible, because you basically, once you've paid to onboard, this is a monthly fee that even a small organization could afford, which is, I think, really exciting. So this group are called Leonardo. There's a couple of others that we're working with, and that's the question. Just to mention a couple of other things that I've been working on over the last couple of years whilst getting married and having a kid, because a couple of people mentioned interest in them. This KIF participant survey is actually just one of a number of tools that we've built for this ecosystem, because we really care about organizations having healthy leaders, healthy organizations, and impact in the world. And so we've worked on a church planning survey that looks at church health and impact. We've developed a psychometrically validated Christian character index. We're going to build out an app that basically helps people journey their own walk with God, and it's got a 360 component, which I think is going to be so powerful, because you're going to give it to your wife and children and boss, and they're going to tell you how you're really doing. We did a really cool, very extensive lit review for that on spiritual metrics. We have an internal culture and staff well-being assessment, because people said to us, we want to know if kingdom values are permeating these organizations. And just to give you one example, we ran this on a charity in this space, and all of their head office people got the vision, were healthy, and all of their national staff were burnt out, right? And the thing I love about that type of assessment, it was an instant policy change. It was a new CEO, and she knew she was a very good leader, so she knew something was up. But this report and whatever it was, $1,000 or $2,000, and instantly she had the information to go and fix that problem. We've built a redemptive practices assessment, which is actually, are you healthy in all of the different areas of the organization? And the exciting thing is I'm actually next week talking to our tech provider to build out the platform to automate a lot of this and make it really accessible. So these are just a couple of pictures. This is our leader assessment, and it's sort of and honestly, the validity of this would offend a lot of you. This is really a diagnostic for a leader. This is very much a work in progress, but to give you an idea of the different areas of an organization that we've built quite a robust assessment around. So I want to just finish with a couple of challenges, and we'll go into some questions. As you can probably tell, I could talk about this for days. These three articles on the right are all things I found relatively recently. So McKinsey recently came out. Everyone aware who McKinsey is, right? They're not incentivized to like talk about spirituality. They are saying, they're basically, I think, almost challenging like the World Health Organization and global definition of health to say that globally, 9 out of 10 people, spirituality is a defining part of their life. And so we need to redefine health as being physical, social, mental, and spiritual, right? I'm like, I don't think we should be the ones, right, shaping this narrative. And I'm sorry, but we're not. And so then you've got the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. You've got the largest, and forgive my, I don't mean to be critical. We are, but I think we could be a little bit more evidence-based and bold in what we're doing. I love you. And I realized I didn't want to come off too hard. So the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, Baylor's largest ever grant, $48 million to look at human flourishing, including this little question of why do people who worship once a week have higher flourishing scores than everyone else? I don't know, right? And then this is an article I just found picked up in Stanford News. There's actually evidence coming out of all of the benefits of faith, which I just think is amazing. So what are the challenges ahead? We've built a tool. We want to keep curating insights. Capturing change over time with a robust methodology is going to be as hard for this, if not harder, than any of the other things, right? So none of the challenges that we've talked about in the last couple of days go away. We just need to apply them to this. What is the influence of faith on well-being? I truly believe in the next few years we're going to be able to start. It's not just going to be ICM who has data on this. Even kudos for Bryce for like running a regression on the people that changed, that became Christians and how that affected their outcomes. This should be the data that like we get really excited about, right? As Christians, right? If we are Christians in impact, if we're not showing impact, we should probably get rid of that word. And if there's not anything distinctive Christian, arguably we maybe should be getting rid of that word. Anyway, and are we able to actually demonstrate this to the world? I actually know somebody who got called up by these guys because they're wrestling with it, and they were like, "Hey, can you help?" Right? So the world is hungry for robust dialogue on spiritual health and impact. So there's my contact. I honestly have a pretty rubbish transitional website right now before we build out the platform, but get in touch with me and let's have a chat. So, open questions or small groups? I've talked at you. What are people feeling? Do you want to lead us, Lane?
I would imagine people have questions.
Okay, let's do questions.
So, we'll open it up. Any questions?
Yeah, a couple things. First, have you talked to Tyler Vanderwill?
Not directly. Read all of his stuff. Know his work.
I've talked to him. He's a Christian.
Yes.
Yeah, so he's the human flourishing project.
He's also very, very busy.
Okay.
I've talked to people who have talked to him.
Okay. I was thinking, maybe I can do that.
Please, no, please.
I could try. I've talked to him.
Let's go. Yeah, 100%. Great.
Second thing.
And I mean, I don't know if you can see this. Yep, that's his paper right there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Second thing is, so probably this is just a moment of learning for some of us. Like, so for me, I never was trained in psychology or like validating methods.
Yes.
Is the idea of what you're doing that I could ask 150 questions, but a lot of those things are just going to be redundant. So we're going to pilot it a lot and use statistics to figure out what's redundant so that we have a nice short method, a nice short module. Is there more to it than that?
That's basically it.
Okay.
I'm
sure there's a lot of in-depth, but...
let me actually simplify that even more. One of my aspirations in this is Gallup, right? Gallup analyzed millions of data points to get to what? 12 questions that will tell you whether employees are engaged. And here's the cool thing. Questions pop up that you don't expect. So one of their questions is, do you have a best friend at work? I'm pretty confident no one expected that question, right? So you have to come at this with actually extreme humility and go, I don't know what the best questions are going to be, But let's keep testing, let's keep proving, let's keep looking at them alongside life satisfaction, alongside poverty, and let's get to that shortlist.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Sweet. So with a lot of these spiritual metrics, and perhaps some of the stuff within the survey, the Kingdom Impact Framework, there's a lot of emphasis placed on somebody's spiritual health, assuming that they are a Christian. There's a lot of questions about discipleship, church involvement, scripture, things like that. I'm not sure if those are the questions that you're interacting with, but it's the questions that I usually see. We use those in some of the contexts that we work in, but in some of the contexts that we work in, the issue is that people are very, very hostile to or closed off against the church, and
Yes.
we're really interested in measuring people's receptivity to the gospel, or if they have any relationships with believers, or these kinds of things. Do you have, in your exploration of spiritual metrics, having, you probably reviewed the literature on this more than anyone I know, do you know of any sort of paradigm for how to evaluate spiritual health from a Christian perspective of someone who's not a Christian? And or you can answer that pragmatically or philosophically if there is a point to doing such a thing, because you could view somebody's spiritual health as binary in a sense until they are a Christian. I don't know. You can take that any direction you want.
Awesome. Amazing question. This is a really hard and great question that I will start by saying, theologically, I reckon even in this room there'll be disagreement. And so, again, I just come with humility at we're working this stuff out. But so that being the caveat. Yes. So first of all, yes, I think you can definitely ask non-Christians about their spiritual life and their openness to Jesus. 100%. Right? And so I don't have the question. Actually, I do. But to take an example from the internal assessment, right? So when you're asking staff and employees, obviously there's no organization that's, well, some maybe, but that's entirely Christian. And so we do that in a really sensitive way and actually ask some filtering questions and even ask them if they're comfortable answering questions around faith and spiritual identity. So there are ways to do this that give you that indication of people's openness, right?
Even asking that filtering question can be used. It's not just for the sake of skip logic. It's you could ask people if they're comfortable answering questions about faith and spirituality. In some of the contexts where we work, their simple willingness to answer yes to that question could indicate progress that's not the case at baseline.
Yes.
I would be happy to see that there was a 40% increase in the number of people, even if we didn't see any conversions, who are willing to answer this question.
Yes. So that's the first thing, is yes, you can ask non-Christian spiritual questions. Second thing, I was recently pushed by someone on this, that there's a difference between conversion and spiritual formation. And I agree with that. Measuring conversion, I think, is nigh on impossible. I also think, thanks to some inspiration from Emily in the great chapters before this, that spiritual formation, and this is like the Engel skeleton, starts before conversion. Right? Amazing example. So I hope that's okay. And we talked about encounters she had as a kid, deeply profound spiritual encounters with the Lord before saying a prayer or getting baptized. How does that feature? Well, I hope that actually, if we would be asking Emily at that age, about her experience of God. It's one of our things, and she'd score highly on it, and that's really important, right? Thirdly, the people I know that are crazy enough to try and measure this, and that's a compliment, are ICM. So ICM right now, and under Dave Sutherland's leadership, are saying, can we actually measure what some people in this room may see as an objective line and others won't? I hope you sense how carefully I'm trying to tread here. And he's saying, and I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with him. So what they're doing is, and I think this is perhaps the only way to do it, and Lincoln and I both have raised challenges with it, but is that they are interviewing a whole number of people in the Philippines, and they're asking them to share their testimonies, and they're having elders rate them. Oh, first of all, they go through the quantitative questions, including our KIF shortlist, and all of the hundreds of questions that ICM have tried, and then they do these interviews where elders rank them 1 to 4 on whether they're far from God, close to God, just following God, or really following God. Simple, 1 to 4. Then they rate whether there's coherence between those elder rankings, and then they're going to see which quantitative questions predict whether people are in or out, right? 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's probably the closest I know. That is definitely the closest I know that anyone's getting to trying to answer that measurement of salvation question. Other groups would be Barna, and they've got some belief statements that they're like, this is what a evangelical born-again believer believes, da-da-da-da-da. That's one option. It's a belief, you know what I mean? And I think this thing is going to be highly fascinating. And the challenge with it, as I've sort of alluded to, I'm fascinated. I want to know how the KIF statements do, all of these things. The challenge will be, is that an objective line that we've just validated against, or is it the subjective opinion of those elders? And that comes down to your theology of whether there's authority of the eldership. It's just, yeah. But let me just go all the way back and just simplify before you're all like, I'm going nowhere near this. I think it's incredibly powerful to be measuring something, right? And so my encouragement, my challenge would be, even if you're not measuring all of the KIF or whatever, be including spiritual health metrics, right? And life satisfaction, because you want, and preferably from validated, Still from Hope or me or whoever, because then that's going to give us the power to really see how those outcomes change alongside the health and livelihood, etc. Sorry, very long answer. Yeah.
That'll be our last question.
Okay.
Okay. Have you validated this in which countries yet? And is there a version of it that I can send to my pastor, for instance? Or
Yeah, awesome. So no, this is more development. The KIF participant survey is more development focused framing. That being said, I think it very much could work, but no, that hasn't been the context of validation. What we have validated in a US context is that Christian Character Index, and I probably need to change the name of that because I think there's even a very old Christian. Anyway, the psychometrically validated measure of character, which includes things like fruits of the Spirit. So yes, that's Western US validated. Yeah.
So we're out of time. But if you have questions, you can follow up. Let's thank James.